Welcome everybody. My name's David Wood. I chair London Futurists. It's sometimes said that if we want better foresight, we should seek better hindsight. And that's indeed one reason why nearly every society puts some attention to the study of history. And when I was at school, we certainly did study history. But what kind of history should we be studying, and what lessons should we be taking from our study of the past, indeed of our study of the recent past and the present pandemic? When I was at school and studying history in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of focus on wars and peace. Understandably, we studied the Napoleonic Wars, I vividly remember, and we studied a lot about the Great War, or the First World War. And that was a time when my teachers could talk about the personal experiences of their parents and grandparents in the Great War, terrible things they experienced. But I don't remember in any of these lessons ever hearing about one fact, which was that something happened at the closing period of the First World War, which killed more people than all of the military conflict itself, which was now called, sometimes misleadingly, the Spanish flu. Great pandemic H1N1 variant of flu, which killed, according to some estimates, 30 million, other estimates 50 million, other upwards to 100 million more people than died throughout all of the military conflict. Terrible that was. And although we studied the war poets and we said, oh, we must never have this kind of unintended war again, there was nothing like the same focus on learning from the past about pandemics. But today's speaker, Debora MacKenzie, has specialized for years, indeed decades, in studying the pandemics of the past and indeed the pandemics of the present. I was very impressed when I read her book recently about COVID-19, the pandemic that should never have happened, as to the fact that she had been studying this right from the beginning of January, at a time when almost nobody else was looking at it, and also that she has been writing about pandemics, as I said, for quite a period of time. But she doesn't just look backwards, as you'll see when she speaks in a minute. She looks forwards with advice, with scenarios about what we may or may not experience and how we can avoid future pandemics that shouldn't have happened. So I'll now hand over to Debora MacKenzie, and she'll talk to you with some opening remarks, and then we'll get into a conversation. Debora, welcome to London Futurists.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. Futurists are some of my favorite people. Now I would like to put my slides on, if I may.
Please do.
Hang on now. I hope in the course of this I can tell you a few ideas that you maybe didn't know, and that it will be useful to you as you're thinking about what we're all going through at the moment and what we need to do as a result of that in the future. I spent lockdown this spring writing a book on COVID basically in 6 weeks, which many people expressed some amazement at. So do I, frankly. I could do that though, because it was not about the day-to-day unfolding of the pandemic. It was about the big picture of pandemic risk, which is a story that I've been covering for a long time, as David said, but it is also the story that remains important for the future because we still live with that risk. And I'm going to go into a few ways we do that in the course of the few remarks I'm going to make now. One important message is that scientists and science journalists like me have been warning about this risk for years. And still, most countries, including the UK, had no plans or preparations for dealing with COVID. That is the situation that obviously has to change. And in order to do that, we have to start governing ourselves more as a global community, because that is certainly how the viruses see us. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, medical science actually believed we had beaten infectious disease, the kind caused by microbes, because we mostly had. We had vaccines for measles and polio and diphtheria. We had antibiotics for TB and the random bacterial infections that used to kill most of us. But HIV/AIDS in the 1980s was a nasty wake-up call. In 1992, this study that you can see here from the US Institute of Medicine warned that humanity was at increasing risk from viruses in wild animals because there were more people. We were pushing into new ecosystems like deep forests in search of food or land or resources. We were disturbing those ecosystems and the animals that lived there, and that made us more likely to pick up new microbes. HIV was in fact a case in point. And then those could spread farther and faster than ever before in crowded cities and with air travel. Those fears have been borne out ever since. This is a small sampling of just my reporting on the warnings, the epidemics, the pandemics, and the near misses that we've had since then. And I'm just one reporter who's been covering this beat. There have been a number of them, as you probably know. I personally am sick of hearing that COVID, and you see this written places, COVID was the first pandemic since the one that David mentioned in 1918. It most assuredly has not been. All of the diseases on this slide are zoonoses, which are viruses we catch from animals. Since 1992, we've had one flu pandemic in 2009, which was widely considered mild, but which killed way more people than usual in their 30s and 40s and early 50s, just because of an accident of viral evolution. It was less lethal than it might have been because it just happened to not kill older people. We needn't be that lucky again. We still, of course, have the HIV pandemic, with 40,000 people living with the virus now and 4,600 new cases per day. People sort of go, ooh, that's not a pandemic. I'd like to know what else you call it. We've also staved a few off. We've actually done fairly well. SARS in 2003 was a coronavirus from bats, very much like COVID, which, as you probably know, is called by a virus that's been named SARS-2. But it didn't spread before it caused symptoms like COVID and like HIV does, come to that. So it was easier to contain. But we were lucky it never got into a big chaotic city like Rio or Kinshasa, or we wouldn't have been able to eradicate it, which we did, largely due to the kind of thing that we're trying to do with COVID now, which was to quarantine cases and trace their contacts and quarantine those. We did it better with SARS. It's a good thing we did too, because it was 10 times more lethal than COVID. MERS, a similar coronavirus from bats, is even more deadly, but it doesn't spread well in people. Every case, however, is a chance for it to evolve that ability, if indeed it can. Then there's Ebola virus, which emerged mostly as local outbreaks that were rapidly contained in Central Africa, but in 2014, an epidemic almost spun out of control in West Africa. And during that, the virus evolved to spread more easily in humans. Fortunately, we wiped that one out eventually too. As I explain in the book, it's a myth that diseases necessarily get more mild after they've started spreading in humans. Sometimes the reverse is true. And then there was Zika, which comes, we think, from monkeys, which causes severe birth defects, and which crossed the Pacific and then the Americas between 2007 and 2016. It's subsided now because natural immunity to it has built up, but epidemiologists tell me that it will be back. As for threats that are still on the horizon, there are several flu viruses that have emerged among poultry and pigs, largely due to certain practices on intensive farms, which could trigger a flu pandemic far more lethal than 2009. Just because they haven't so far doesn't mean they won't. There are plenty more coronaviruses in the bats that COVID came from, and then there's Nipah virus, and this is the one that scares the scientists I talk to. It's carried by fruit bats. It has recently spread across South Asia. It kills half or more of the people who get it, and it's starting to be able to spread from person to person. Not very far. It's a bit like MERS in that respect, but it's starting to be able to do it, which is scary. So, if we're futurists, what can we conclude? Well, it's that the future contains more of these kinds of emerging diseases, some of them worse than COVID. But as Tony Fauci in the US has said, emerging diseases are inevitable. It is not inevitable that they turn into pandemics. So that is where we need to focus our attention. It's instructive to look at some of the stupider reasons that we failed to contain COVID. Countries did listen to the warnings. This thing is from the risk register in the UK from 2010. And as you can see, the UK put a flu pandemic as the biggest threat on the risk register. It did it again in 2015, above terrorist attack, which was all the rage at the time. And that was after the swine flu of 2009. It still realized that, yes, this could be a bad problem. Yet the only pandemic plan it had was for flu. And that was a problem when COVID showed up. Case finding and quarantine using testing and contact tracing, as the World Health Organization, to be fair, has advised from the start, is what contained COVID in South Korea, in Singapore, Vietnam, Taiwan, and New Zealand, and in fact in China. China tried to conceal the seriousness of the outbreak in Wuhan for the first 3 weeks of January. And that led to uncontrolled spread there, and indeed let it slip out and spread around the world. But China then cracked down on containment, and no city anywhere else in China had to lock down. They kept it contained with quarantine and case finding, test and trace. That was enough if it's done right. But that kind of containment doesn't work for flu. Flu spreads too fast. So if all you have is a flu pandemic plan, you had no plan when COVID hit because it didn't include containment. The UK was one of many countries that didn't do containment terribly fast or terribly well for that reason. That's the kind of limited imagination we need to get over to face the future. Now, there was a big global assessment just last year that found virtually every country's pandemic preparedness was, and I quote, grossly insufficient. One reason is that governments find it hard to spend on future risks if they don't know when they're going to happen. You can say that a pandemic is definitely going to happen sometime, but if your elected representative in particular doesn't know if it's going to happen during their term of office, then you tend to not get quite so much spending on it. California made a PPE and ventilator stockpile after SARS, but it was sold by the next governor during a budget crisis, and that's just one of many such stories. On a rainy day fund is always the first to go when other priorities for spending come up. Hopefully, after COVID, we'll be less likely to scrimp on pandemic prep. But what exactly should we do? What I found over the years, and what was particularly obvious when I was writing the book, is that there's a huge disconnect between warnings from scientists and actual actions by government. I talked to a number of senior scientists who've been warning about this for years as I wrote the book, and said, okay, in the light of what's happened now, what would you say about this? They all said that it's just no one's job to sift through the warnings and make sure action is taken on the most serious ones. It's as simple as that. In my book, I concluded that the pandemic never should have happened, not just because we've been warned for years about pandemics in general, but because we were warned specifically about coronaviruses in Chinese horseshoe bats, and no action was taken. No drug, no vaccine research. In fact, they actually stopped what they were already doing in the wake of SARS. No urgent policing of bat-derived products on the market. The Shi Lab in Wuhan and the Barrack Lab in North Carolina actually put it, as you can see here, in the titles of articles, so no one could miss it, after they found bat coronaviruses already primed to infect human airway cells with no need for any further adaptation. As for how it could get from bats to humans, the evidence for that fish market is weak, to say the least. On the other hand, this is a remedy that is widely sold in China and worldwide on the internet. It's a traditional medicine made of dried powdered feces from exactly the same bats that carry SARS-type coronaviruses. You take the dried powdered bat feces, you make a water extract, and you put it in your eyes, an organ full of the ACE2 protein that these viruses latch onto. The idea is that bats can fly at night, so they must have very good vision, which actually they do. So touch of the bat might just help you if you've got eye problems. Every culture has got remedies like this. The danger of this preparation was probably not obvious over the centuries that it has supposedly been used. Probably drying the bat poop kills a lot of the viruses in it, and any that did survive might simply have failed to spread farther, as indeed COVID itself often does. Moreover, in previous centuries, there were fewer people around to use the remedy and fewer people living in less crowded circumstances for them to spread it to if one happened to jump. It needn't happen often. And the genetic evidence shows that the COVID virus this time jumped only once into one or at most a few people, because there was almost no genetic variation among the early cases. This remedy, Yuming Sha, was quietly removed from the pharmacopoeia of traditional Chinese medicine last summer. Internet sales appear to have been shut down, but I'm not aware of an effort in China or elsewhere to make sure this and other bat products have been taken off the market, despite warnings from Chinese scientists going back to 2005. Now, some think that one of the things we need in the future is an authoritative intergovernmental capability for looking at scientific warnings like this, deciding when a potential threat requires action, and then making sure that action happens. It has to be someone's job to do that, because currently it isn't. I'm sure the WHO would, If it had the funding and the mandate and the political clout, it currently does not, and that might be something to consider. We also need to stop humans interacting with wild animals in risky ways. Quite so much, and indeed I have to stop interacting with this cat in quite this way because she's sitting on my notes. See you, kitty. Okay, there's one proposal to factor the potential costs of pandemics into the way our decisions about how we manage land use. You've probably never heard of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is called IPBES for short. You've probably heard of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which puts together the scientific consensus on climate to present to governments. Well, this is the same thing, but for conservation and biological diversity. They've just estimated that controlling the global wildlife trade and reducing land use changes that would rub people up against wild species, especially through deforestation, would cost $40 to $58 billion per year. It sounds like a lot until you put it against the estimated $8 to $16 trillion cost of the pandemic just until last July. One way to bring this home to companies who maybe want to clear cut a forest that's got a lot of bats living in it might be to suggest that they could be liable for damages for infections unleashed by their activities. That's one avenue that's being suggested. Finally, we need to make some way for countries to find out and then tell everybody when they have worrying outbreaks. In early January, as we mentioned before, China told the WHO about its cluster of mystery pneumonia cases in Wuhan, but claimed the virus did not spread person to person, even though its doctors knew it did. The WHO could not go into China to verify, talk to the doctors, see what they were saying, because China had to issue an invitation for it to do so, which it did not do. Basically, the WHO couldn't say, oh, you've got a new disease, right, our inspectors will be there in the morning, book us some rooms. I mean, there are arrangements internationally which do allow international organizations to do that, but the international health regulations, the treaty that governs diseases that might cause a problem internationally, absolutely insists on the sovereign rights of member states. Obviously, this is just not good enough anymore. Pandemic risk is too important to entrust to any single country. I'm not pointing a finger at China here, anybody. Countries are notorious for not wanting to let people know when they've got new diseases on their territory or any diseases on their territory. We all share the risk, though, of a new disease that comes up. So we must all share responsibility for managing the risk. Stands to reason. International treaties famously cannot be enforced, but what you do with an international treaty is you verify it. Under the nuclear and chemical weapons treaties and others, like the Bretton Woods agreements, countries set aside sovereignty so international inspectors can ensure compliance with rules everyone has agreed to because it's in everyone's interest. If the international health regulations had allowed the WHO to insist on a visit to Wuhan in early January, when the doctors knew COVID was contagious, the global response might have been much faster, and we might have made the pandemic easier to manage. It's just a thought, but we have these kinds of provisions in other treaties, for example, the treaty governing chemical weapons, and a virus like COVID is way more dangerous than any chemical weapon I know of to far more people. And frankly, COVID, by comparison with some of the others that might break out, is relatively mild. So I hope I've given you some ideas for how we might, as a species, go forward with pandemic risk. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Excellent. That's really set a lot of topics in our minds. There's already a bunch of comments and questions, which I will turn to momentarily. I would ask the audience to put questions in the Q&A window, and the advantage of that is you'll be able then collectively to vote on which questions should be addressed sooner. Deborah, how serious are some of the things that you've spoken about? You've said that Nipah worries scientists particularly. What's different about something like Nipah compared to COVID, which, although it's been bad, we probably will fight off in due course?
We hope. Well, the thing with Nipah is that in the early days of COVID, you know, I was following it on the epidemiological bulletin boards like everybody in this business. And it was saying that it doesn't go person to person. And I'm going, okay, you know, I can keep celebrating New Year's. No, it's not going to be a problem if it doesn't go person to person. And very often that's what new viruses in people do, like the H5N1 bird flu virus. We're worried about that because it's got a very high mortality rate. But it has never learned to spread person to person. It's very difficult for a new virus and a new organism to find the exits and get into another victim, which a virus has to do. So, you know, yeah, the really scary thing about Nipah is that it started to do that. Also, it's spreading. It came up in Malaysia when there were forest fires in Southeast Asia that drove a lot of fruit bats out of the forest because the fruit wasn't setting because of the haze. They went on to people's farms. They dropped half-eaten fruit in pig pens. The pigs got sick. The people who took care of the pigs got sick. We learned about this virus. And then it spread into Bangladesh. It spread into contiguous India. And a couple of years ago, it spread all the way across India into Kerala state. So it's on the move. It kills upwards of half the people who catch it. And occasionally, in this last couple of outbreaks, they've seen that it spreads to the carer for the person who got it than the person looking after it. After that person might get it and also die. And it's, you know, it jumps to one, maybe two people. For example, MERS does that. Often a new virus in humans will do that, but it can evolve every time it gets a chance to, you know, adapt to humans. And if that thing started spreading, I think we'd be in trouble. That's why Nipah.
And what about the evolution of viruses? Because it's commonly said, oh, the viruses will naturally evolve into a less deadly form because if they're too deadly, they won't be able to spread and they have an evolutionary advantage to not killing people. But is that always the case? I mean, I seem to have read that the virus in the second wave of the 1918-1919 flu pandemic was more deadly than the first one, for example.
That is a very widely repeated and misunderstood story, but all we have to do is think about it for a minute. It is true that if a virus is too deadly, it'll kill off its host before it gets a chance to spread. With few exceptions, if the host dies, the virus dies too. And you know, Ebola is one that lingers on for a little while, but generally speaking, it's got to spread before either the host dies or the host defeats the virus with their immune system. So it can't be too serious. But let's think about how that selective pressure works. If you've got a virus in a population that is excessively deadly, for example, like myxomatosis was among rabbits when it was released in Australia famously, and at the same time in France, interestingly, terribly lethal, killed about 95% of the rabbits. I mean, really, you know, especially in Australia, it was incredibly lethal. And at that point, it stopped being easy for the virus to find a new victim. The ones who had survived were mostly those who, for accidents of their immune system, were able to resist it. So, you know, it might have died out at that point, but there was a strong selective pressure for a virus that didn't kill its victims quite so fast. Now, lesson one, that selective pressure doesn't emerge until the virus has in fact killed enough of its hosts for the resulting scarcity of hosts to be a problem for the virus. So first of all, it has to be deadly. And then one of them, if it's there, that doesn't kill quite so fast, might in fact be what is selected for and causes the next wave of infections. And in fact, that happened with myxomatosis in Australia. It wasn't exactly mild. It still killed 50–60% of the rabbits, but it took longer to do it. So it was more likely to spread. But then what people saw was that the infection in rabbits got a lot more mild because the rabbits that survived all that were the ones that could resist it. And so everybody went, oh, look, myxomatosis, you know, it killed off a lot of rabbits and then it got milder. Viruses must get milder as they spread. It's not quite how it worked. Furthermore, it had to kill a lot of rabbits before that could even become a selective pressure on the virus. And the final nail in that coffin is it's now getting worse again. It's becoming more virulent for the resistant rabbits that survived. So no, it's not quite like that. HIV has been spreading since about 1920, we think, and it hasn't gotten any milder. It doesn't have to. You know, it spreads before the person gets seriously ill. Ebola, there's evidence that the Ebola virus in West Africa in 2014 acquired a a mutation that instantly was in all the subsequent cases after it initially arose, that basically made the virus more transmissible in humans, which is entirely what you'd expect. I mean, it's not terribly transmissible, and it would be favorable for the virus if that cropped up, and it did. So, in fact, that virus, just in the few months it was circulating in West Africa, got worse. It's just, you know, if you think, oh, it automatically, it's not like the virus stands back, surveys the situation and thinks, oh, I better not kill quite so many humans. I mean, you know, I won't be able to spread so easily. You know, it has to kill a lot first for that to even become a factor for the virus. It's not that simple.
Some things are getting worse, but aren't some things getting better as well? I'm going to turn to one of the questions which have got the most votes. This is from Jose Cordero. Mm-hmm. He says, aren't we getting better at developing vaccines? It took centuries to develop the first vaccine, and then decades for many viruses. And now potentially we have a vaccine in about a year for COVID-19. With the incredible advances today, including more use of artificial intelligence, don't you think we'll be prepared with almost ready vaccines off the shelf for any new deadly diseases that arise?
Indeed, that is one of the inspiring stories of the COVID pandemic. We had kind of got it together, despite years of warnings, we finally got it together and set up a consortium to put together public and private money to do exactly that, to take the viruses like Nipah, like bat coronaviruses, that scientists were warning us about, and do some work in advance so we'd have a vaccine ready to roll if one of them emerged. But very little had been done about that. It was a good idea. And now the organization that was set up to do that is in fact shepherding some of the research indeed for a COVID vaccine through trials. You know, it was already working on a vaccine for MERS, but there hadn't been very much done. There hadn't been very much money put into it. I think people until now weren't really, I mean, it hadn't really gotten through to decision makers just how bad this could be. Everybody who's in a position to be a decision maker now pretty much grew up since vaccines came in and got rid of all the things that used to regularly kill people's kids. And they're just not used to it anymore. Now we realize just how bad it can be. I think there was a major failure of imagination. When you're called upon to put your money where people's prognostications are, sometimes there can be a failure of imagination. Now we know how bad it can be. And indeed we do have the technology to come up with things. There was something, people keep calling COVID disease X, that's really wrong. There was a list of things we're worried about from the WHO. One of the things they were worried about was coronaviruses from bats, just like this. So it was on the list. But then they had one called disease X, which is a virus we don't even know is out there. We want technologies developed to fight a virus that's a total surprise. COVID was not a total surprise. It's very similar to SARS, which we already had. But something totally new, and some family we didn't know could do this. We want, for example, to have a tested platform for vaccines that we can just stick a protein from some totally unexpected new virus on and be ready to roll with a vaccine we know is going to be safe. That's the sort of thing that they want to do with disease X. They were doing all the right things. They just weren't doing them very much or very fast. Hopefully that will now change.
Are you able to say something about some of the work that impresses you most in terms of making vaccine development not only faster, but more general, so that instead of us needing a special vaccine each time for each new disease, there's something available? For example, one question, again from Jose Cordero, is about the work of George Church at Harvard. He's quite an eminent genetic professor of genetics. He suggests that we could modify the human genome in due course so that we'll become immune to a whole bunch of viruses.
I'm guessing George Church is an immunologist.
Okay, so what does impress you and what doesn't impress you about some of the claims and the hopes that have been stated in this area?
Well, obviously we should throw out all the ideas that we might have. Sometimes the craziest ones are the best. I doubt that is, though, because the human immune system, as we are being reminded once again by COVID, is an incredibly complex thing. It's a can of worms. In fact, I once saw a journal article put on the cover of a scientific magazine, and the way they illustrated it was literally a can of worms. The immune system is so complex that like any complex system, it's very easy to just poke it the wrong way and suddenly get a disproportionate response. Things spin out of control. That's how a lot of people are dying of COVID. They get over the virus, the first 7 to 10 days, the virus is gone, and then you get the relapse, which is in fact your own immune system that's gone into overdrive. It was tipped into overdrive by its response to the virus that just got out of control, and all the feedback mechanisms just went awry and things. You know, the idea that we could just tweak some genes and somehow get an immune system that would respond better, you know, I doubt that's going to work out. On the other hand, we can learn how to prime our immune systems to respond to more kinds of pathogens. There are a lot of virologists out there who are just itching to get out there and swab a few bats and find out what all the other things are. I mean, bats are, you know, they carry a lot of nasty germs just because of an accident of their immune systems. But there are other animals too that carry viruses that can get us. And, you know, like if we get a better picture of what there is out there, we could, for example, it's conceivable we could do a pan-coronavirus vaccine. One of the things that might happen soon is a universal flu vaccine. As you possibly know, flu changes every year. It's evolved to do this to evade our existing immunity. It is one beautiful bit of biological design, the flu virus. It just, you know, gets us just sick enough to keep going. And every now and then it gets really bad and kills a lot of us. So, you know, it would be nice to have a flu vaccine that we didn't have to change every year, because then also we won't need to get a flu vaccine every year for ordinary flu. But then when a pandemic flu comes along, the universal vaccine will work for that too. We don't have to cook up a new vaccine. And there are bits of the flu virus that never change because they're part of the viral machinery, can't change. There's going to be an announcement, I think in the next month or so, by an Israeli company that's done the first phase 3 trials of a universal vaccine. And they wouldn't tell me what they were getting, but they sounded very happy last time I was talking to them. So chances are we could get a universal vaccine for flu very shortly. And that's the sort of thing we need for a lot of different pathogens. So you ask me what makes me hopeful. That is something they've been talking about for years. I actually won an award for an article I wrote in 2010 in New Scientist about the prospects for a universal flu vaccine. That was 10 years ago. Now somebody's finally doing it. Back then, we knew enough about it to know we needed it, and it's taken that long. That's what makes me less than hopeful. People just aren't putting enough into this.
So what would it take for more people to take that idea seriously and make it happen quicker, rather than us being back in 10 years' time saying, oh, it would be nice if there was a universal flu vaccine?
Well, COVID-19 pandemic, that makes us, you know, realize that pandemics are not a good idea. A universal flu vaccine is something we could have stockpiled for a flu pandemic because it works against all flu. It'll work against a pandemic flu and not just, you know, the winter flu. So that would be good because, you know, flu pandemics can be pretty bad. 1918, as you said, was. You know, there are other things as well. The pan-coronavirus vaccine. There are a lot more coronaviruses where COVID came from, and not all of them, well, some of them are sufficiently different. For example, if you had SARS 17 years ago, a lot of those people still have immunity to it, by the way, which bodes well for coronavirus vaccines. Having had SARS, they still have immunity quite a ways later. So yes, you can get durable immunity to these viruses. Those people, however, would not be immune to COVID because it's just different enough that there's not overlapping immunity. If we could get a universal coronavirus vaccine, then we'd be immune to a lot of them, maybe, if we can do that. Now, that is something that I hope people will start working on, and with a lot more alacrity than they did on universal flu vaccines, because people have been talking about these literally for decades.
So we'll continue this line of discussion in a moment. Just a couple of housekeeping remarks. People are asking, is this recording going to be available afterwards? Yes, it will. So you will find this and recordings of other London Futurists events on the London Futurist YouTube channel. And in terms of deciding which questions you like, if you go to the Q&A window, which you can access from a button at the bottom of your screen, those of you who haven't found it yet, then you will see for each question, you can hover your mouse above the thumb if you want to give it a thumbs up. So having done that, let's come to the question which is top of the pile by PNJ, Peter Jackson, and it's continuing the discussion we were having a minute ago. Can you suggest a good mechanism to persuade governments to protect resilience budgets instead of defunding things when the public aren't looking?
Make it international.
Make it international.
Yeah, set up some international agency whose job it is to look at these risks. Let's just limit it to pandemics for now, because that's enough to be getting on with. International Pandemic Governance Agency. We defeated smallpox largely with vaccine, and I always use this example to illustrate how this used to be a public good and not something made by private companies. There was no profit in a smallpox vaccine, but it was made by the New York State Public Health Department, believe it or not, and the Soviet Union. They made most of the vaccine that we used to eradicate smallpox. Because it was the height of the Cold War and both the Americans and the Soviets were involved in the smallpox eradication effort, well, they were damned if the other side was going to make more vaccine or do more work or get more people in the field. And that competition was what propelled a lot of it. Before he died, the late, great D.A. Henderson, who ran that effort, told me that, in fact, the Cold War was helpful because, the two different sides in it didn't want to be seen to be making less of an effort on smallpox eradication than the others. I'm sure we could harness feelings like that again. Just a thought.
So how do you assess the international bodies that have been looking broadly in this area? How do you assess the WHO, given that it's been widely criticized for some of the things it's done in the early days of COVID?
Well, as I mentioned, Trump, for example, says, oh, they kept it from us that this spreads person to person. No, they didn't. They didn't know it spread person to person. The Chinese were saying it didn't. I know some of the virologists there were going, really? I'd like to see some evidence of that. But they couldn't. And what is really a mismatch here is that we were all at risk from that virus, as we all now know. I think it was probably just some local guys in Wuhan were going, let's just keep it quiet. This is like SARS. As long as we isolate all the cases, we'll be fine. Which they were with SARS, if they did that. But this was different. Obviously, we now know it spreads before it causes symptoms, and it was everywhere. Far farther spread than the authorities there were aware of. And when some of the really very world-class scientists in China realized what was going on and sort of, told the central authorities, then China clamped down like a ton of bricks. But by then it was a bit too late. If there had been international attention to this earlier and it hadn't been in the hands of just some local guys, and that's just China, this might have come up in, say, Burma, and they wouldn't have had the epidemiological tools to realize they had a problem and recognize that they had a cluster. It might have happened in the United States and the people who were sick didn't go to hospital because they thought it was just flu and they couldn't afford to go to hospital. There are lots and lots of ways this sort of thing can get out of hand in different countries. We all need to get together to work on this because, like I say, the virus looks on us as one big pool of meat. We should really maybe just act like it for once and get together on it. And I think that's the way to face the next one.
Just to confirm one point then, a question by Matt Monak. Are you saying that if the WHO had been allowed in Wuhan early on, it might have ended up just being a relatively small local epidemic?
Well, depends on when it got in, whether it found out the thing was person to person, and whether it then said, "Oh, guys, we've got to do something here." Those are a lot of big ifs. But I can't imagine that it wouldn't have been clamped down on a bit more early if there'd been that kind of attention to it. As a matter of history, during SARS, China was a very different place then. It was 2002, 2003. But basically, people started admitting in China just how many people had it and how bad the problem had become. When a team from the WHO was finally allowed in and got to talk to the other doctors and scientists. And, doctors and scientists usually level with each other. Technical people communicate very well. And if that happens, then you find out what the truth is and stuff gets done. Really, it ceases to be kind of a small-time political football, and the scientists who know how serious this might be start becoming the ones who are, ruling on it. And I think that would happen in any country, really, not just China.
So one thing you said earlier is that something that you've noticed again and again is that there have been plenty of intelligent warnings from scientists, but a lack of a corresponding set of actions from politicians. There had been lots of preparedness exercises. In the UK, there was the Cygnus exercise, or Project Cygnus, a few years ago, which discovered that our preparedness in the UK was poor. Apparently, cabinet ministers sat ashen-faced in briefings when they saw things how things could develop. But again, a lack of follow-up. So is that entirely due to poor international relations, as you mentioned earlier, or are there other factors that could have resulted in a better response to the findings of the likes of Operation Cygnus?
Well, again, it's a lack of follow-up, and you know, everybody criticizes China for, you know, rightly, for having kept the fact that that thing was contagious secret for a critical few weeks. But then again, you know, the UK was in no hurry to tell its own citizens that its own pandemic preparedness was not up to scratch. I don't think that report has been released yet, has it? And you know, let's just go and keep this quiet is always the response of government for things that it's not forced to do something about. If that stuff had been, you know, presented to some international, you know, forum of some sort, of course, there are limitations. There's another question on the notice board here saying, look, they looked at it and apparently they looked at the wrong things. They rated the UK and the US most prepared for a pandemic. Yeah, their metrics were a bit off. There's a lot of things on paper, a lot of, you know, yeah, I think the question puts it in a nutshell. They looked at the technology, they didn't look at the leadership. And that was it. I mean, the really inspiring story from this pandemic was South Korea, which of course remembered SARS, and had a narrow escape from MERS. They managed to beat it back when it got loose in their hospitals a few years ago. And at that point, they said, okay, we're going to stop messing around, and had some plans in place as soon as they found out about this thing. Apparently, the leadership called their top virus testing manufacturers and said, how soon can you make a test for this virus? We will give you fast track permission to get it out there and start using it. And you know, we'll do the regulatory stuff at the same time so you can just get out there and start testing. And they kept it contained. Now, they don't know more science than everybody else, but they knew this could be bad. They knew what had to be done, and they got it done. I think everybody should learn from the countries that did it right. Vietnam. You know, people say, oh, well, New Zealand, yeah, they're an island. Yeah, Vietnam isn't. I mean, you know, they kept it down. China managed to keep it from spreading in the community everywhere outside Wuhan. Wuhan had to lock down. Shanghai didn't. They shut down a lot of the, you know, the city transport. They did social distancing. They had people having to have their temperature monitored if they were going to go into a store or something. They set up fever clinics for people who did have a fever so they could be tested. They did variously aggressive things, but it wasn't a lockdown. They managed to keep it at bay just by testing people and then making sure that people who were tested got quarantined. Now, Britain is starting to test people in Liverpool this weekend, which I think is absolutely fabulous, especially since they're using one of this new generation of tests that in fact is sensitive enough. It's not perfect, but it should be good enough, according to the people I talk to anyway, to be able to tell people when they've got it, when they need to quarantine. The problem will be getting people to quarantine. Now that's where the leadership comes in. Are we serious about this or aren't they? I was shocked to hear that the number of people who quarantine after they've been told they need to do it was something like 20%. No wonder it's not working. You know, no wonder you've got a lot of people dying from COVID. You got to take this seriously and make it stick. And if ordinary people won't do it just, you know, spontaneously, which I think ordinary people don't tend to do spontaneously if they're not really sort of led to do it by their government and perhaps backed up with some kind of sanction, then, you know, there has to be the leadership to make that happen.
So let's follow up then on the difference of different countries in their seriousness and their effectiveness in addressing these threats. The question from Matt Monak: do you think the West is just extremely arrogant for not following the approach in Asia? As you've just described now, the mass testing and rapid local containment. To him, it looks like the West thought, well, we can do it better. Are there good examples in the West? I mean, New Zealand is one special case, but are there other countries in Europe that have done things a bit better? Not just initially, because I used to point to Austria and Czech Republic and Germany as having managed well, but it looks like there's a bit of this social uncohesion as well now, and more people complaining about the things we're being asked to do.
I think you put your finger on it. Social cohesion plays a large part in it. Having social cohesion, having a social contract, having a lot of trust in the people who are telling you what you got to do, caring about whether other people die, you know, not subscribing to an ideology that says that all I have to be is strong and be a fighter and, you know, want to not get this disease, and that's enough. Apparently there's been a book called The Secret. It's been sold millions of copies in the States lately that actually makes people believe that the power of positive thinking is going to keep them safe. And, you know, if a lot of people believe that, then they're not going to think, well, I don't need to make sacrifices to, you know, keep all these other weak people who are, you know, not positive enough and are getting this disease from dying. You know, they can, you know, when it's made your fault if you got sick by sort of popular thinking, then there tends to be not a lot of adherence to sort of collective action to stop people dying. That seems to me to be a kind of a mental pollution that's got loose, not just in the United States by any means. But then there's also, as you say, arrogance in the West. I remember reading at the height of it in I think March, an assistant health minister in Italy was telling an interviewer from one of the Italian papers, it was like watching a train wreck, watching what was happening in China. You know, it was awful, it was terrible. Nobody ever thought it would come here because we're the West. We don't get killer diseases anymore, right? But then, you know, they also had an enormously good response. And then there was the town of Vaud, who just tested everybody and kept it out, you know, quarantined everybody with it. It wasn't that Westerners didn't know what to do. You know, it's just that they just couldn't get it together to do that. And I think the important word in that sentence, as you suggest, is together. We need to learn to act collectively again.
And what role do political leaders play in this? And by the way, for those watching, apparently the BBC have called the state of Pennsylvania for Joe Biden. So apparently more and more of the media around the world are now saying Joe Biden is going to take over as president. How significant is political leadership in changing the attitudes inside countries and in encouraging the kind of cooperation between countries that you've said is key to a more effective preparedness for future pandemics?
Well, clearly Trump was kind of in a class by himself. But, you know, other people who are perfectly decent governments didn't necessarily do so well. I mean, Germany did really well, as you would expect from a government as efficient and sensible, run by a scientist. You know, I mean, Frau Merkel is indeed a quantum chemist, and I bow as a humble biologist. You know, like that out-sciences me. But, you know, they're having trouble now too. They're not doing as well as Vietnam did. We need to really face up to this risk in a way that continues to sort of like that gets past technological preparation. I mean, I'm sure we will have, you know, stashes of PPE and ventilators that are second to none after this experience. But will we have the idea that we require collective action in order to do it, that it's not everybody for themselves? It's interesting that countries where individualism is more of a credo, Britain and the States and in the event, did worse than countries where there is still some social contract. I think that's probably where Vietnam had the advantage. They've got an authoritarian government too, which isn't such a great thing, but they can order everybody to quarantine if they're told to. But then, you know, South Korea is a very vibrant democracy and they did it too. It's not just a matter of that. I think a lot of it has to do with social contract and just the realization that, yeah, we do have to worry about disease. And if they tell you to quarantine, you know, you're going to kill somebody if you don't. You know, the whole business about, oh, well, you can't infringe on my freedom by telling me to wear a mask. I keep remembering the guy who lived across from me when I was at a university in the States, who played loud rock and roll music on his front lawn, you know, during studying hours. It was a student neighborhood. I was trying to work, and he had his music on outdoors. And I said, could you please turn that down? You know, you're playing it in my living room. And he said, that's a free country. And I went, no, you're not free to play your music in my living room. You can play it for yourself, but you know, the idea is that freedom is we get to do whatever we want, and it doesn't matter what that does to other people. And that's not the idea. You're not free to drive your car down the sidewalk either. People don't see wearing a mask as not killing other people, you know, which is basically what it is, because you may not be at risk of dying from that, but that person over there who's 45 and has diabetes might be, and you don't know. So, you know, like the idea of freedom, the idea of individual responsibility, the idea of social cohesiveness, that is something that I don't think we've lost. We've just kind of got the wrong idea somehow over the years. And, self-indulgence is very tempting. But, we need to foster in some way more of an idea that we're all in this together. We really do. And that has to cross national boundaries as well.
We'll come back to humans in a minute, but there are some questions about bats. And
Yes,
I remember
please.
a whole chapter about bats in your book, which is fascinating. We're not going to have time to go over all of that now, but Sanake Tularia asks that he thinks that he's heard that the 50-degree in-flight body temperature of bats made them a good candidate for incubating resilient viruses. Are there other animals that we need to be wary of alongside bats? And what should we do with bats? Should we be trying to constrain them and control them in some ways?
Good heavens, no. It's not 50. No mammal could withstand that. 40 is about as tall as hot as a mammal can get without falling apart. But it is about 40. In fact, birds are at about that temperature too, for similar reasons. They fly, and flying takes an enormous amount of work. So if you fly, you need to have an incredibly high metabolic rate and therefore a very high temperature. It's not that the simplistic idea that the temperature breeds resilient viruses. I mean, basically it's that because you have a very high metabolic rate, there are some things that the mammalian immune system does that you just can't do. Because you can't do it for various technical reasons when you're running your machinery so hot, basically. And so bats do something else. Instead of having an inflammation response like we would, and you get out the big guns of the immune system and they kill the cells that are infected by the viruses, and it's a very complex and tightly controlled system. Bats do it another way entirely. They've got this hair trigger mechanism that just stops viruses getting into their cells at all. They really just worked this out recently. The paper actually came out while I was writing the book. There are other papers too backing it up. It's not just this one. But basically what happens is that viruses do occasionally get into some bat cells, and the bat can tolerate that. So it maintains the infection. It doesn't fight it, so it doesn't get symptoms. Most symptoms of disease are caused by our immune system's attempt to get rid of it. And the virus never gets out of control, so it doesn't really hurt the bat. The bats carry millions of viruses. The only one we know that hurts it is rabies. It's only American and North and South American bats have actual rabies. Bats over here have a virus that's very similar, slightly different. But they seem to hurt the bat slightly. The rest of them don't, like the coronaviruses don't. But it's because they've got this very different immune system that's dictated by the fact that they fly and they've got this amazing, metabolic rate, which is why they're so hot. So, it all sort of ties together, but like everything involving the immune system, it's a little bit more complicated than you were expecting. But for that reason, bats have got all these viruses. At the same time, one thing I was not aware of before I wrote this book, I wasn't planning a whole chapter on bats. I ended up having to write one because I learned all this great stuff. We wouldn't have rainforests in Eurasia and Africa if it wasn't for fruit bats, because they're the ones who plant all the seeds. Those of you who like a shot of tequila or mezcal, agave, the plant they make it out of, wouldn't have it without bats. They are absolutely the only thing that pollinates those plants. Apparently there's billions of dollars worth of insects that eat our crops that are eaten by bats every year. No bats, we'd have to dump tons of insecticide on them and it probably wouldn't work as well. Don't get rid of bats. Bats are an absolute keystone species. The ecologists have come up with this concept. There are some species in the ecosystem that we kind of need more than others. And it turns out bats are among those species. They're just absolutely necessary, and they're everywhere. You may not be aware of bats, but England has the most wonderful bat colonies. Sit in the pub garden sometime, dusk, and just look up, and there's amazing numbers of bats up there. They're really important. So A, we need them. B, we really should not rub up against them very often because they've got all these viruses. C, that's no problem. Maybe one person, two people a year in North America get rabies from a bat. Most of them tend to be bat researchers who weren't as careful as they should have been. I mean, it's really hard to get bat viruses from a bat. We can keep them around and not worry about it if we're not eating them or making medicines out of bat poop or, selling them on markets or whatever happened. The reason that fish market in Wuhan was implicated in the early spread of COVID is because it jumped from some sort of bat source into one or maybe a few humans, and then it spread human to human. And where do humans get together so they can spread viruses? Markets.
So that answers the question that Warwick Harnius has put in there, which is why the wet markets were blamed instead of the bat dung.
Yeah, about half the early cases were linked to that market. The really early cases that they knew about, that they talked about in the first, the minute that the Chinese government came out and said, okay, it spreads human to human, Chinese scientists were ready to roll, and they had a paper in Lancet in just a day or two. And it basically listed all the various exposures that were known for the first, I think it was 41 cases, I can't remember, that they knew about. And maybe half of them had a link to that market. The very earliest cases that they had in that paper anyway didn't. Now, people wanted to think, the reason a lot of them were connected to the market was one of the things that drew the attention of the Chinese doctors to begin with, because that's how SARS first started. They were getting it on a market. And that probably was contaminated by bat material in some way, and it was, people were picking it up on the market for that reason. They've never really been able to establish any way that that could have happened on the market in Wuhan. And just too many of the early cases had no connection with it. That now people think, well, you know, this thing spreads person to person. The genetic analysis has shown very clearly it only jumped once, one bat, maybe one person, maybe a few people, but, you know, not 41 people getting it from 41 different bats, because then there would have been a lot more genetic variation in the early cases, and there wasn't. So basically it probably just jumped once and then all went person to person after that. And you'd expect to find that on the market. So now they're looking around for other places it could have been. The pangolin thing, by the way, no good evidence. They really have not found a virus in pangolins that is closer to the virus in humans than the virus in bats is. And you know, what really clinches it for me is that research finding that the virus in bats could infect humans fine. It didn't even need to evolve any further. It didn't need an intermediate species. And so you look at the fact that people were taking water decoctions of bat poop and putting it in their eyes, which has a lot of ACE2 receptors, and you think, gosh, I wonder if that could have been it. You know, and it only needed to jump once. This stuff might be safe most of the time, but just once. And it's somebody who's living in a crowded city, you know, and then it gets loose.
Could we learn from how bats keep most of the viruses at bay? I mean, you mentioned they've got some hair trigger system to stop viruses getting into their cells. Are people figuring out what that mechanism is and to what extent it could be applied in humans as well?
Well, they're learning that this hair trigger interferon response is very important for the bat cells. I doubt we would ever be able to function like the bats. We don't, we're nothing like them, you know, metabolically. But the more we can learn about the immune system and its various wonderful manifestations, the more likely we are to be able to control our own. Interferon is very, very much involved in our immune response to COVID. It gets turned off by the virus early on. Surprise, it's a bat virus. It turns off interferon. Interferon's what, you know, is the chemical that triggers the bat defense. And that is as far as I get, because that's as far as I've, you know, read the literature, and you know, go to the scientists for the rest of it. But you know, that's the kind of lead that, yeah, the more we can learn about the various internecine wiles of anybody's immune system, the better off we'll be.
So what about teaching people? This is a question from Iwa Chodorowska. Why don't we teach people more about the importance of looking after their own immune system, healthy living, importance of good food and sleep, keeping stress under control, good farming practices? Isn't that part of helping us all to avoid getting ill? And then we wouldn't need to depend upon clever new vaccines and international restrictions.
Well, we need belt and braces. I mean, you know, diseases are going to jump, whereupon it would help to be more ready for them. But then there's things we can do to stop them jumping. Now, I was very encouraged when I saw the biodiversity community weighing in on this and saying, you know, if you guys weren't chopping down forests and, you know, giving bats the necessity of moving onto farms and pooping into pig pens, and, you know, we would not be rubbing up against them so much and getting their viruses. This is obviously a way in which we are becoming more at risk of animal diseases or animal viruses that could jump to us because we're going in and ripping down forests and messing with ecosystems and, getting rid of species and destroying natural balances. And none of this is a good thing if you're trying to avoid being infected by viruses from animals that are out there. But there's also things we can do to increase our own defenses. One thing I'm a little wary about, though, with things, well, if you eat healthily, and live clean and don't smoke and don't drink and, you won't get sick, that's A, not true. And B, it's part of a general movement to sort of make it people's fault if they get sick. It's all because of you. This is partly down to the shift we've had in recent years now that we have, in fact, defeated a lot of the old infectious diseases. A lot of our new diseases, hypertension, blood pressure, diabetes, Alzheimer's, they are called lifestyle diseases because they seem to correlate with whether you're overweight, whether you smoke, whether you drink, whether you don't get exercise. And they do, they correlate. All those things affect your likelihood of getting those diseases. But it also kind of makes it your fault if you get it. And I don't know if that's necessarily going to turn out to be the case. There is recent evidence that there are, in fact, bacteria involved in a lot of those diseases. And what you do when you don't live healthily is your immune system gets a little out of whack and it lets them go a bit crazy. It might not entirely be down to your lifestyle, although your lifestyle affects it. Yeah, of course it would be better to live healthily and we should do everything we can to promote people living healthily. But I think we should maybe get away from the idea that people are responsible for if they get sick or not. I mean, that's a lot of what has hampered the response to this pandemic, is people thinking, oh, well, I'm good, I won't get sick. I'm not going to deprive myself of the joy of getting together with my friends down the pub, and I'm not going to wear a mask, just because these weak people are, not taking care of themselves and they're going to get sick and die. People just don't believe when something like this happens. It's a well-known thing in human psychology. People don't believe it'll happen to them. They figure it'll happen to other people. And that's the beginning of this lack of social solidarity, social collective thinking that we need in order to defeat any communicable disease. The hint is in the word communicable. It spreads, it's all of us, and if we think, oh, well, it's only people who don't live healthily. I mean, it's true. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that the questioner was wrong. It's true, we should live more healthily. All of us should. I should lose about, oh, God helps me, I don't know many pounds it would be good for me to lose, but lots. But, and it would be nice. But if we haven't, and then we get sick, is that our fault? Should we think of it that way? And is that kind of thinking kind of getting in the way of the solidarity we need to defeat infectious disease? I don't know.
I think you said it before. We need a more than one approach. Healthy living is certainly a part of the answer. Healthier agriculture, less strain on the relationships with animals where we're bumping into their territories. That could be part of the answer too. But that shouldn't take away from the imperatives to behave in a socially responsible way and also to invest in new medical treatments.
Pretty much sums it up, yeah. I mean, we need bats out there. We do not need them in our pigsties. We need to think about what we do with the ecosystems of this planet because, we might pay the price in a nasty disease. Diseases are going to jump. We need to be ready for them. Some of them do come from bad agricultural practices. H5N1 bird flu arose basically due to vaccination of chickens for bird flu, which seemed like a good thing to do because your chickens weren't dying of bird flu, but then the bird flu kind of evolved in response and then we had something out of control. Unexpected things happen. I mean, we are dealing with a complex system. You jab it anywhere, it might do something you weren't expecting because complex systems are like that. And so you're right, we need to do all the different kinds of things that we've identified that impinge on our ability both to avoid triggering pandemics and then to respond to them when they happen. There are certainly things we could do to make us, all healthier. The idea of a tax on sugar. On sweetened beverages, which are a way a lot of people consume too many carbohydrates, which is really bad for them. We should fund research into how a lot of those diseases happen and how we can control them. Right at the moment, it would be a lot better if a lot of people didn't have out of whack immune systems for various reasons, which puts them more at risk from COVID, and that's going to be the case with almost any infectious disease. We should learn more about that. I mean, there's a lot of shoulds here, but I suspect the first thing we should do is sit down and do some serious planning on how to address the next time this happens, and really get it into our heads that there is going to be a next time, and it's not going to wait around. It's not going
Well,
to be in 100
how
years.
bad could the next time be? And we titled the session "Anticipating the Next Black Death." When the Black Death wiped out probably 30% of some parts of the population, it triggered huge social changes. Should we worry about such a large thing happening as the repeat of the Black Death? Is that
Well,
on the cards at all?
that's really interesting. I suspect you might have read chapter 7. I
Well,
asked
I've read the whole
exactly.
book and I recommend it all, absolutely.
Great. Yeah, chapter 7 was the depressing one. Actually, yeah, a friend of mine once asked me, I was talking about bird flu and it could kill a lot of people, and I was really worried that it might, become communicable. And she said, well, I hate to say this, but wouldn't we be better off with fewer people? I mean, somebody has to say it, maybe we would be. And I started saying, well, okay, you're right. The Black Death of the Middle Ages did kill a third of the population, they think, in Europe anyway. And that society didn't collapse. It triggered some changes, but it kept on pretty much as before. Would that happen here? Would that happen in a modern society? And to cut a long story short, I discovered no. You take a whole lot of people out of a modern society, it's a much more complex, sort of vertically integrated society than medieval Europe, which was kind of a horizontally, and almost everybody was a subsistence farmer, a food producer that produced a small surplus that kept the aristocracy alive. You take them out, you remove the producer, you also remove the consumer. Very little happened. Nowadays, let's say you take out the truck drivers, and there's no food deliveries. Let's say you take out the people who refine the fuel that allow people to deliver coal to power plants. There are a number of cases. Let's say you take out enough international transit. We were worried during the first wave of COVID that we were going to stop getting a lot of our basic medicines from China. Fortunately, China got into control very quickly, but we would have been in trouble if they hadn't, because we've got a globally integrated economy, and if you take a bit of it out, lots of other bits of it go down, because we're living in a globally integrated complex system, where if you knock out one bit, and that includes taking people out, lots of other bits fall over, and you can't always predict which ones. Interestingly, when I was writing the book, I discovered something that we're all aware of now, which is that the people particularly at risk of dying in this pandemic also happen to be the essential workers that had to keep working for everything else to keep working. I mean, the people who keep the power plants running, the people who keep the garbage collected, the people who put the groceries on the shelves, people who service the ATMs so you can get some cash out. I mean, it's we cannot say that a lot of death is something that we could weather. A bad pandemic could cause knock-on effects in our complex system that would knock over a lot of our basic support systems, and could get very bad, basically. I mean, collapse is not something that is very pretty ever. And a bad pandemic in our highly urbanized, highly integrated society would not be a good thing. Let's just put it that way.
It's not just that we're integrated and that there's more travel. It's that, as you said, many of the systems have tight dependencies.
Yep.
A society that's loosely coupled can absorb shocks, but a society like ours that is more tightly coupled transmits shocks with the unexpected things. Like our personal immune system, you pointed out, is more complicated than a naive understanding. If you try and tune up our immune system, we could have autoimmune diseases or cytokine storms and so on.
Exactly.
But likewise, if we fail to appreciate the connectivity in our modern society, there are futurists or social studies experts like Thomas Homer Dixon or Jared Diamond and others who, Joseph Tainter, have I got his name right? I can't remember. The person who maybe founded this field, did his writings 20 or 30 years ago, collapse of complex societies.
Yes.
It's like the Roman Empire had many tight dependencies, and when it fell, then, at least in some aspects, we entered a kind of a dark age. That only affected part of the world, but in today's very highly connected world, the consequences could be even worse. And so, as well as improving our individual immune systems, we have to improve our global immune systems.
The interesting word in that sentence was global. A lot of people there's been a resurgence of national feeling of thinking about the planet in a zero-sum kind of way. You know, if you're doing well, that's got to hurt me. You know, and you know, about another country or another community or whatever. And unfortunately, one thing I learned a bit more about while I was writing the book was something called the behavioral immune system. Apparently, humans get more xenophobic when they are just faced with the idea of disease. When the threat of Ebola maybe reaching the States happened in 2014, there was a researcher who called a bunch of Americans and asked them about their voting intentions. And then after the Ebola thing went through, he called them again and said, so what are your intentions? A lot of them moved from Democrat to Republican. That could be, I mean, people are wondering why there are so many people voted Republican that time. I wonder if the threat of disease might not have been part of that. They found that really consistently. And a lot of other kinds of research done by a lot of other people. Basically, we have a tendency as humans to be sociable and to reach out, but also to be conformist and to stick with our own kind. And you kind of wonder where that came from in our evolutionary past. Apparently, we were trying to avoid disease. When we saw another tribe of humans who didn't look like us and did things differently, chances are they had a completely different history of encountering microbes. And they might be carrying things that they've got immunity to that we don't have immunity to. I mean, the all-time, you know, proof of that theory was when Europeans invaded the Americas, and a lot of the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas died of the diseases the Europeans were carrying because there was no resistance.
Measles and smallpox,
yep,
and so on.
Yep, and oh gosh, I mean, just ordinary disease, flu. You know, as recently as the 20th century, there were people in the Canadian Arctic who tended to get horrible disease epidemics like that from white people coming through. I mean, it was you know, it's terrible. And in fact, apparently, we have evolved a mechanism. This apparently is the basis for a lot of xenophobia. When we feel threatened by that kind of thing, we tend to fall back on more conformity, more sticking to people like us, more not liking to hang out with people who aren't like us. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that if we've got that tendency, it had to come from somewhere. And weirdly, it seems to have come from an evolutionary history, and that's what they're proposing, of avoiding foreigners, because yeah, you never know what they're carrying. So, you know, also we should hang out with foreigners because you never know what they're trading. And there was that kind of tension in our early history. But we came down with the behavioral tendencies to do both those things, and apparently the suggestion of disease, showing people pictures of disgusting objects, apparently makes them more xenophobic, more conservative. That's just the way our brains work. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying we have to deal with the way the human brain works.
We have to understand ourselves.
Yeah.
Self-knowledge is the beginning of wisdom.
Totally.
And it's similar to other research, which has showed that people fear immigrants more if they perceive that they're living in a time of economic depression. When there's plenty to go around, they're quite happy to have new immigrants joining their community, or moderately happy. But in a time when the lack of jobs, then inevitably people say, hey, they're stealing our jobs, we don't want them here.
Or even a perceived lack of jobs. I mean, all the research shows that immigrants typically do not do that, except maybe for the previous wave of immigrants. They don't take jobs from natives. In fact, natives tend to do well out of a wave of immigrants because all sorts of jobs get created and they tend to get promoted, you know, to do the jobs that only native people who speak the language can do. So, oh, there's tons of research like that. But that's human perception. Oh my gosh, they're not like me. Therefore, you know, they'll threaten me in the way that I tend to feel threatened. And for some people, it's jobs. But apparently disease kind of exacerbates that. And we've all just lived through a pandemic. So, you know, I found it encouraging, at least, that the United States, many people in the United States, chose to respond to the pandemic by demonstrating against racism. I kind of wonder if, you know, like it made it all very salient all of a sudden. And some people responded by going, no, we're not going to be like that. We're going to go out and we're going to do something about this. That at least is a positive thought.
There's about 10 minutes left of our discussion, so time for one or two more questions. Again, I ask the audience to multitask if you dare, listen to the ongoing conversation, but maybe have a quick look in the Q&A in case there's something you think deserve more attention. I do want to feed in a question by Cornelius Holtorf, because it follows on nicely from what we were just talking about, which is that there are many risks ahead of humanity, not just the pandemics, but the impact of climate change, wars and refugees, racism and social unrest, global inequality of wealth and quality of life, climate terrorism. I mean, how can we prioritize against them? You talked about international cooperation and you said, well, start off with, let's just focus on pandemics. But how would you, from your other writings, I know you've got more than one hat, you're not just a pandemics expert. How do you decide which attention should be given to which of these issues? Or are they all the same from one point of view?
Well, they certainly all do tie together. I mean, certainly one of the impacts of climate change is going to be vastly disrupted ecosystems. And if a disrupted ecosystem means humans are going to encounter animals bearing strange new germs more frequently, well, then there you go. I think if we get into the habit of behaving as though we are a global species, if, as Thomas Homer Dixon says, we have to start using the term we to mean all of us, because that's certainly how the viruses see it, I think we'll be, that much farther along towards dealing with climate change as well. All of those are global and collective threats and require global and collective kind of responses. I mean, some of those adjectives trigger some people to go, oh my God, she's a communist. No, I'm not, by the way. I have red hair, yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean. But basically, no, I mean, collective just means we're all in this together, and you don't need more politics to prove that when it comes to a virus. COVID is doing it quite nicely. Any of us can get it, any of us can die of it. Older people are more likely to, but that's just, the way disease works. That shows we're all in this together. Climate change shows we're all in this together. The impact of inequality on our economies and on our quality of life everywhere shows we're all in this together. All of it does. If we get better at working together, maybe on pandemic avoidance and preparation, because maybe we'll be motivated to do that now that we've all been through COVID, that might be the nucleus for more cooperation in other areas. I don't think we should see it as either or, but man, I think we should start somewhere.
It's like out of the chaos of the Second World War, there was an international spirit of let's do things better this time. At the end of the First World War, the attempt to create the League of Nations didn't really work. And people saw after the Second World War that the more effective institutions need to be created. And although it's current nowadays to criticize the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and so on, there was some great work done, I believe. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a remarkable document in terms of its ability to transcend multiple cultures and integrate point of view. So perhaps out of this chaos, there will be much more of a concern to leave behind our parochialism and reach an international agreement.
That would be good. I mean, I speak as one who lives on the doorstep of Geneva, and I know a lot of people working in the UN, and it's part of my job to criticize the UN. Gosh knows I have criticized the WHO many times. It's kind of required to. You criticize your government too, don't you? That doesn't mean the institution of government is not a good thing. Where would we be without it? I don't think. Too many people believe that pure anarchy is really a good thing. We need to have some institutions that enable us to work together at certain scales. It's just that now that scale needs increasingly to be global because the effects of what we do increasingly are global, and nothing illustrates that better than the current pandemic. We need ways to come together. Now we have the WHO. It gets about $2 billion a year, which when you consider all the things it does, and it's been vastly increasing its activities over the last few years as the disease threat has increased, is an amazingly small budget. It sounds like a lot, but for an international agency that employs a lot of people all over the world and does a lot of things, it's not that much. And governments, keep knocking it back because they think, oh, well, we don't really need this. Yes, we do. I mean, health is governed increasingly at a local level. I mean, we saw that in the United States in particular. It's a state thing. In my own country of Canada, it's a provincial thing. You know, health tends to be governed on a local basis. But health threats, I think we now must recognize, are global. And there's really only one global organization that deals with them. You know, the WHO, you can criticize it all you want. I think it's done very well, given the resources it has. It was right from the beginning. It was saying from the beginning, you got to quarantine, you've got to trace contacts, you've got to contain. You know, you shouldn't go straight to just shutting down your transit and your gatherings and hope that that will do, because no, you can contain this virus. And a few countries did, and most countries didn't. You know, that's not the WHO's fault. But, you know, it could sure use some help. It could use a lot more money. It could use a lot more people, and it could use a lot more people taking it seriously and saying, look, we've got to do this on a global basis. The WHO is the only game in town. You know, we've got to stop using this as a forum for asserting our rights as its sovereign countries and start finding ways to use it as a forum for transcending that in order to work together in an integrated way. A country should not be able to say, yeah, we got this disease, but now you can't come look at it. You know, that might threaten all of us. There's got to be a way around that. We've found it in other areas. We should find it in this. And the forum for doing that has got to be the WHO. They may not like my saying that, but, you know, that's the only thing we've got at the moment. How are we going to face disease on a planetary level when we've only got one World Health Organization?
What about related risks of weaponizing viruses? Is that something that you worry about? There's a question from Richard Ballarand. We haven't talked about, was the COVID somehow human engineered?
It wasn't.
It wasn't, but
no,
might
absolutely no way. If you look at it, I'll tell you what really convinces me. The virologist said we wouldn't have known enough to do a virus like that. Nobody would have designed that binding site. Nobody would have thought it would work. It does. We found out when we saw COVID, you know, straight from the bat. But, you know, yeah, they didn't know enough to build a virus that would work like that. And when scientists say that, I tend to believe them. I mean, there are ways they could engineer a coronavirus that they know about. None of them look anything like what actually happened. As I have heard people saying since the 1990s, Mother Nature is the best bioterrorist. A lot of these concerns arose from exactly what you were just mentioning, from the concern about bioterror. Everybody suddenly started realizing after that 1992 report from the US Institute of Medicine, oh my gosh, we're sitting ducks. You know, somebody could use this as a weapon. And indeed, it turned out the Soviet Union and a number of other countries had very active biological weapons programs. Who knows what's going on out there, but COVID wasn't. That much we can say.
But could there be other outbreaks, especially if there is a wider distribution of DIY genetic engineering capabilities, you know?
That worries me.
Doug Pipchuk asks, do you see as a risk with upswing in genetic engineering? He says he can already buy a CRISPR kit and run it in his basement. Will viral vectors become more dangerous? And maybe by accident. And as you said, people didn't anticipate what this new form of coronavirus would do. They wouldn't have designed it like that. Is it possible people will be messing around and there'll be an unexpected consequence? You're
right, that does cut both ways. And yeah, that's what happens in complex systems. There are unexpected consequences. My favorite one on that was, oh gosh, what year was it now? Back in the 2000s. A couple of Australian scientists are yet again, myxomatosis taught us a lot. Now this time they were trying to get rid of some introduced mice. And they were trying to engineer a pox virus to kill off mice, you know, sort of like we did it with myxomatosis, let's do it with the mice. And so they just took out a gene for an interleukin, one of the intermediaries that's a signal in the immune system, which, as we mentioned, is incredibly complex. And if you poke it, it can do stuff you don't expect. And in fact, yeah, it did things that they didn't expect. Jabbing around with the interleukin gene, or the gene for the factor that affected interleukin in this pox virus that mice got, basically created the perfect mouse plague. This pox virus just killed every mouse it got near. And we had a vaccine very much like the smallpox vaccine that protected mice from it, and it didn't protect mice from it anymore. This virus got around it, and these guys carefully autoclaved all their samples and all their stocks and went, oops, we weren't expecting that. Um, and published a paper that my colleague in Australia reported immediately, in New Scientist, and said, "Oh wow, that was a near-run thing." And then a year later, I was at a meeting in Geneva, and we were talking about the possible threats of bioweapons. And this guy said, "Well, we know that the Soviet Union was working on a smallpox weapon. They were. And so I'm going to look to see whether you can do this interleukin thing with a virus that can infect humans." Because they might, and we got to learn about this. And I was sitting next to D.A. Henderson, who was still alive at the time. I could just see the steam coming off him. There were a number of people in the room who were just going, "What?" And it turned out it was not such a good thing for him that he mentioned this meeting, because I think a bunch of them then called up the safety authorities in the U.S. and said, "Are you really permitting this?" But if he hadn't mentioned it at this meeting, he probably would have gone ahead. He had, BSL-3 containment. Who knows? It might have been perfectly safe, but he was sort of, hoping that it wouldn't, like generalize to humans. But, that is a really dangerous thing to be doing. And this guy was just doing it, and because he could. And the dwindling band of people who follow this stuff and are concerned about it sort of go, well, the safety, restrictions aren't as great as they could be. I don't understand why biohacking is legal. I don't understand why you can buy CRISPR kits and sort of do stuff in your basement. I haven't followed that very closely, but I suspect that because we are dealing with a complex system here that can do things you weren't expecting, that pox virus being a case in point, we shouldn't be letting people do that. Really? I mean, the guys who do the research on gain of function with pathogens, I'm personally, I actually broke that story on H5N1.
So gain of function pathogens means making them in some sense more deadly than
making them worse to see if they can do that. Everybody was worried about H5N1 bird flu because when it gets into a human, it's 60% lethal.
And the reason for doing this research is to prepare things in case it happens naturally, so that we will have that. Yeah, so that there's a positive motivation for doing it. It's not to make a weapon, but at the same time, weapons might arise on it accidentally.
Well, the thing is that everybody was worried about this bird flu, but it didn't go person to person. And people were starting to say, well, it hasn't evolved to go person to person. There's a lot of it out there. Maybe it can't. And so this guy in Holland sort of did a simple experiment to see whether it could evolve to go people to people. And yeah, it did. And these are the mutations it needed to do it. And this is what we need to watch for. And oh my gosh, we need to take this seriously as a threat, because it could. You can't just say, oh, well, it's not a threat because it hasn't become contagious yet. It could become contagious. Now, that's an important thing to know. If you've got a virus out there and you've got to spend money to control it, you sort of think, well, gee, maybe it would be worth spending some money to control this thing, because we know it can conceivably become a threat. I mean, that's research I think it's worth doing if it's very, very stringently contained. And I have to say, I suspect if anybody can do that research safely, those guys in Rotterdam can do it, because they've got a very, very heavily contained lab. So, okay, fine. And there are BSL-4 labs around the world that are also heavily contained. They've got an Ebola vaccine. One of the reasons they've got an Ebola vaccine is because they could work with Ebola in BSL-4 labs. Wouldn't have it if they couldn't do that. There's the one in Winnipeg was critical, in Canada was critical for developing that vaccine. And we could go in and stop the Ebola outbreak in Central Africa past couple of years from being worse than it was, because we had that vaccine. So yeah, we need to do that research. But there's always the risk of escape, so we need to take it very seriously and not let people mess around. And there are still fears that people might develop bioweapons. I don't know. There was always the argument that people can blow each other up fine just flying planes into buildings. Why would they bother using a germ? A germ can always blow back on you. I'm more worried about accidentally creating a nasty pathogen, like almost happened with that pox virus, than I am about deliberate bioweapons programs. There probably are bioweapons programs out there. They can make mistakes too. And yeah, it's kind of worrying. But I think I agree with the scientists who say Mother Nature is the best bioterrorist. Look at COVID. That wasn't engineered.
Just to close, what are your views on lockdowns? That's the highest remaining question from Gary Jenkins. Are you a fan of, where necessary, the mass lockdown, given that regional lockdowns don't seem to have been very effective? Why don't we just focus on looking after those who are most vulnerable and let others carry on at generating wealth?
I'll say it again. We can't. It's just not practically possible. We can't take everybody who is likely to die from this virus because we don't know which ones they are. Yes, older people are more likely. People with certain conditions are more likely. But, you know, some kids can get it really seriously. So 20 and 30-year-olds have got this. You've seen the pictures of the health staff that have died of it. Some of them were quite young. We can't protect everybody who might get this. We don't have they can't take everybody that might be predisposed and put them in a big building somewhere and then let the rest of society get on with it. For one thing, that's a lot of society taken out right there. I know it seems simplistically appealing to say that. It seems even more appealing if you're thinking that the trade-off is somehow between economic damage and sickness, economic damage and lives. And the people who tend to think that there is a trade-off there tend to be the ones that think, oh, well, I'll be all right. It's just, you know, unworthy people who die of this thing. I'm sorry, but that does tend to be kind of a tendency underneath the, I'm not saying that the person who asked that question necessarily feels like that, but many people who put forward this idea seem to think that. I will quote proper economist Joshua Gantz at the University of Toronto, who also put out a very rapidly written book on COVID, and he has now revised it and it's coming out next month. It's about the economic impacts of COVID and of pandemics, and I recommend it. Basically, he says there is no trade-off between the economy and health. There is no way we can run a healthy economy when a lot of people are dying. It just doesn't work that way, because lives are worth something, because shortened lives or limited lives have an impact on the economy. In 1918, American cities that shut down, that all you can do is lockdown with flu. You can't do containment because it's just a different virus. American cities who did that effectively and who didn't have as many deaths from flu snapped back more quickly from the 1918 pandemic economically than cities that had a lot of deaths. Deaths cost, no matter who they are. The thing is that, what do I think of lockdowns? I think they're a bit like abortion. They should be rare because we have ways of preventing ever having to get that far. I was talking to a very senior UN guy about this, and he said, I do not know how we could possibly have any kind of preparedness for what is happening now with the economic damage and the job losses and you know, how horrible it's been. And yeah, I know how. South Korea knows how. Vietnam knows how. You know, you do what the WHO says. You get serious about testing and finding contacts and containing, because you can contain this virus. The whole point of lockdown at this point is to get the number of cases down to the point where, when we come out again, we can contain. We can find all the cases. There won't be so many cases that we just cannot practically do it. There will be few enough cases that we can find them, we can find their contacts, we can quarantine them, and we can stop it spreading, and we can do what South Korea did and what New Zealand did and what Vietnam did. That's how you handle this virus. If you don't do that to begin with, before you get large case numbers, the only thing you can do is lock down until you get lower case numbers, and then do containment. There's no point locking down if you're not going to follow it up with that. That's the point. And so many people don't seem to have understood that. I mean, yeah, it's a shame to have to do that. But, you know, eventually, if you follow it up with containment, you will get rid of the virus. You can't shelter those who might die and let everybody else get on with it. It's simply practically not possible. And if you entertain the idea that you're going to have that much death in your society, then you're condemning your society to untold economic damage, because, you know, a lot of death is just not a good idea economically. It's not just a matter of a bunch of old people who aren't doing anything. You get rid of them, what the hell, we're young, we'll get on with it. I think that's how a lot of people think about it. It's not that simple. It's never that simple in a complex system, and we are a complex system.
And the name of that economist whose book you mentioned, Joseph Gantz?
Joshua Gantz, G-A-N-S. He's in the economics department at the University of Toronto.
And you recommend his book?
The title of the book is, because it's different from the one that came out a month ago on Kindle. The print version is coming out and it's got a different title.
Okay.
The Economics of Pandemics, I think. Can't remember.
Well, maybe we'll get him on a future London Futurist.
I'm sure he'd love to. He's got a great blog.
Well, thanks for the tip. And your own book, is it being revised? Because I mean, you wrote it remarkably quickly, and I'm sure there are things that have happened since it came out in when? June?
Oh, yes. Well, I tried to stay away from stuff that was going to change. I couldn't completely, obviously, but I mean, people say, you know, it couldn't be worth anything if you wrote it in that short time. Well, you know, I wrote stuff that I've been writing about for decades, and you know, and learned a lot about bats, and learned a lot about China, and learned a lot about, you know, I did a lot of new reporting for it as well. You can do a lot of new reporting in 6 weeks. But the thing is, I knew the framework already. I knew the big picture story about this. And so I just plugged recent events into that and just wrote it really quickly. I'm a news journalist. I write pretty quickly. But yeah, I'm coming out with a revised version with a couple of new chapters. But it's still going to be looking at the big picture. It's not going to be saying, you know, Boris Johnson shouldn't have done this at this particular point in time. Other people will do this. Richard Horton certainly has. The book that he brought out, same time mine came out. I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at the big picture. I'm looking at, you know, we face this pandemic risk as a species. What as a species do we do about this? You know, what have we done in the past? What does this teach us about what we should do in the future? And there's not much of that has to change. I'm going to have to write some new things into it. But
I think you mentioned when we were chatting earlier, you have another article coming out this weekend, hopefully.
Yeah, there's going to be.
Can we mention anything about that?
There's going to be an article in the Observer on the guy there wanted to know, look, when will things be normal again?
When will things be normal again? Well, the answer, things are never going back to the old normal, are they?
Well, the thing is, yes and no. It depends on what you mean by normal. I mean, hopefully it won't go back to the old normal of thinking, pandemics, that's not going to happen. We don't need to prepare for them. I mean, the widest possible sense. I hope it doesn't go back to that. But people do tend to think, oh, we'll get a vaccine, everything will be all right overnight. Well, for various reasons having to do with the way vaccines work, that's not going to quite be the case. In the end, I think testing is what's going to be the real breakthrough. If we get really good, reliable testing, we can do ourselves. People have drawn the analogy with pregnancy testing, and yeah, it could be a lot like that. We could be testing ourselves before we go down the pub just to make sure we're all right. I mean, you know, whatever. Eventually, enough people will have immunity to this virus. I hate to say herd immunity because it's a term that has become used and misused politically. If enough of us have immunity either from a vaccine or from having got the virus, and in the past, you know, with very few exceptions, vaccines are the only way we get that. But if enough of us are immune, the thing will stop circulating. I don't think it'll go away completely. I think there will be little pockets where it persists because this is a global virus and we're a global species. And there will be places that don't get the vaccine or don't use the vaccine, or there will be places where the virus somehow manages to persist some way or other. I doubt it's going to be eradicated. You know, we're working hard on eradicating polio virus and we're not quite there yet. We managed with smallpox. That's the only time we've done it. I don't think it's going to go away completely. So we're going to have to keep our guard up, especially immediately after the vaccine is introduced. A lot of us might get vaccinated, but the virus, for various reasons, is still going to be circulating at a lower level, hopefully, and killing fewer people, but still circulating and still able to kill people who are just, you know, unlucky immunologically or whatever way they will be to be extra sensitive to the virus. So yeah, things aren't going back to normal overnight when we get the vaccine, but the vaccine is the only way forward. And we're going to have to couple that with a bunch of other things, that, you know, testing, for example. They're already bringing in testing as a way of being able to get on an airplane and feel safe. And, you know, and to be able to fly to other countries and be able to say, I am not carrying the virus into your country. And that maybe will now be brought in to replace these quarantines that people are slapping on people from other countries in order to stop them carrying the virus around. We can still have, you know, global travel. We just have to find a way to not carry our pathogens with us. And I think this will be the nucleus of a much broader program, perhaps in the future, to stop that happening. I mean, the research was fantastic early, and done a lot of it done at the University of Southampton. The research early in this pandemic really showed conclusively that people on airplanes were how this virus spread. So that's actually going to be something we have to pay attention to. And I've been talking to the airports associations, and they're talking about bringing in, you know, fast tests for the virus. In the same way that when I get on a plane here in Geneva, I'm often given a swab on my hands and they stick it in a machine and they say, okay, you haven't been handling explosives lately. You can get on our airplane. Something as simple as that. okay, you're not carrying X virus, you can get on the airplane. You won't give it to people on the airplane. You won't take it to your destination. I think there's going to be a lot of that in the future, because that's one really good, easy way of dealing with the problem.
So there are practical things we can look forward to, like the testing and tracing improvements, and indeed vaccinations. The bigger questions of how do we encourage a more collaborative international mindset are the topics that the one forthcoming London Futurist event will be addressing. I'll just mention that now. In 3 weeks' time, on Saturday, the 28th of November, we will hear from Simon Anholt, whose book is The Good Country Equation.
Indeed, I've got his book.
You've got his book, yes?
Yeah.
So do you recommend it?
Haven't got a chance to read it yet.
Yeah, that's a problem with most of the books I buy as well, yes, but I saw him at another event recently.
Very good.
But he talks about how can we do to encourage individuals to think more globally and responsibly, but also critically, how do we encourage countries to realize it is in each country's best interest to have a more collaborative global approach. So Simon will be sharing some of his experiences in that meeting in 3 weeks' time. There are other London Futurists events that are in the process of being organized. Keep your eyes on the meetup page or on the Twitter feed where more will be announced. Deborah, you have been fascinating and very informative. I think we're all much wiser now. I do encourage people to track down your book and read it all the way through. There is a lot to be learned and a lot to challenge our own thinking. And of course, also to look out for other articles that you're writing. Thank you so much for taking part in this discussion.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.